Thank you very much. So, hello everyone. As mentioned, my name is Liana DiNunzio. I'm a shorebird biologist at Manomet, and my focus is on shorebirds that migrate through Massachusetts. So, hopefully, some of you caught Lisa Shipley's presentation at some point today. It was very good, but also provided some nice background info. But if you didn't, that's okay. I'll make sure to catch you all up. So, Manomet is a nonprofit organization that has been contributing to shorebird conservation and research throughout the Western Hemisphere since the 1970s. And many of the shorebird species we work with are long-distance migrants. So this means they nest as far north as the Arctic and then spend their non-breeding seasons way down into South America. And Manomet's approach to shorebird conservation includes conducting targeted research to better understand the causes of shorebird population decline, because as a whole, shorebirds are a declining group of birds. We also support a network of partners throughout the Western Hemisphere that help to identify threats to shorebirds and their habitats, as well as implementing conservation measures on the ground. So some of these conservation measures might include improving or creating shorebird habitats. So one of the ways we carry out this approach is through our Coalitions for Shorebirds program. So Manomet has designated 17 important shorebird sites throughout the Americas as Coalitions for Shorebird sites. So this means that we're committed to supporting shorebird conservation in these locations. And we do so by working with local partners and the communities to help alleviate threats to shorebirds at these sites and to improve habitat for them. So in 2022, Manomet designated Cape Cod as a Coalitions for Shorebirds site. And we've been ramping up our work in the state ever since. Although I will mention, Manomet has a long history of shorebird work in Massachusetts, starting from our beginning with our original shorebird biologist, Brian Harrington. So a little background on shorebirds in Massachusetts. So Massachusetts has over 1,500 miles of coastline. And while most of this, well, not most of it, much of it is developed, there are still some natural areas that not only attract tourists, but also attract shorebirds. So in Massachusetts, shorebirds might use coastal habitats such as beaches, salt marshes, mud flats, and tidal creeks. But some species will also make use of brackish or freshwater habitats, such as wetlands and the shorelines of ponds and lakes. Massachusetts has two regionally important shorebird sites. These are designated Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network sites, or WISRN sites. The first one is the Great Marsh up on the North Shore. And this consists of 20,000 acres of salt marsh, tidal creeks, mud flats, and a large barrier beach known as Plum Island. Maybe some of you have been there. The other one is down on the elbow of the Cape in Chatham, but it's Manomet National Wildlife Refuge. And this is a series of barrier islands that also has extensive mud flats around it as well. And between these two sites, tens of thousands shorebirds are supported by them. And that doesn't even include all the shorebirds that might be using the rest of the coastline in between them. So you'll see different species of shorebirds in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. This is going to be very similar for Rhode Island, depending on the season. So in the summertime, we have a few species that breed here, including the willet, the American oyster catcher, and the federally threatened piping plover. Many of you are probably familiar with the piping plover on many of our beaches, mostly due to the management of them to protect their nesting habitat. In the winter, we have a few particularly hardy species that spend their non-breeding season here, such as the purple sandpiper, sanderling, and dunlin. So some of these species you can see right now in New England. So go out and check it out. But the times of year that you're going to see the greatest numbers of shorebirds and the greatest variety and species of shorebirds is the spring to one extent, but very much so in the fall. So this is the time of year that the shorebirds are migrating. So in the spring, they're migrating north to their breeding grounds. And in the fall, they're migrating south to their non-breeding grounds. And Massachusetts serves as a stopover area for these birds during their migrations. In stopover areas like Massachusetts are places where the shorebirds will stop to rest and refuel so they can continue their long journeys. And although they only spend a short period of time here, it's absolutely crucial for them to be able to survive their journeys and then to successfully breed. We have just a few photos of potential migrants you might see, some western willets and whimbrel, short-billed dowagers and red knots, some whimbrel on that end. So with Massachusetts being important to so many shorebirds, and with Manomet ramping up our work in the state, we thought it'd be a good idea to kind of get a baseline of what shorebird migration looks like in Massachusetts. So we decided to organize a shorebird blitz. So some of you might be familiar with bio-blitzes or maybe even have participated in them, but they're really intense efforts to catalog organisms in a certain location and during a certain period of time. So in our case, we were focused on shorebirds in coastal Massachusetts during peak fall migration. So shorebird fall migration typically runs from July to about November, and the peak is somewhere around mid-August. So we were shooting for the mid-August timeframe. And our goal was to get a snapshot of how shorebirds use our coast during this peak migration. We were also interested in highlighting and identifying some of the important stopover sites in Massachusetts. And in addition to data collection, we also wanted to kind of draw attention to this declining group of birds and highlight their amazing migrations. We do plan on making this a fun annual event. So the first step in planning the first shorebird blitz was figuring out where we needed to survey. So we already had some known important shorebird sites in mind, like those two wizard sites I mentioned, the Great Marsh and Manomet National Wildlife Refuge. And we also used existing international shorebird survey sites that volunteers had already been regularly surveying during the migration season. But there was a lot of kind of gaps in the coastline, so we needed to find more sites to survey. So we headed to eBird and were able to download some data on shorebirds that have been found in Massachusetts by eBirders during this time frame, and we're able to get some hot spots from that data. We also just asked around. We asked shorebird enthusiasts in the state where they think the best spots are and which spots we should focus on, and we got a lot of great input from them as well. So from all these sources, we were able to compile a pretty good list of priority survey sites. The next step was finding some people to survey all of those sites that we detected. So overall, we had 89 participants. Many of these were volunteers. Some of them were existing international shorebird survey volunteers, so top-notch shorebird surveyors. We also reached out to local bird clubs to help recruit experienced, skilled shorebirders. And we reached out to partner organizations. So these included municipal, state, and federal government agencies, as well as conservation nonprofits. Some of them manage shorebird habitat, or they study and monitor shorebirds during the breeding season. And overall, there was 17 partner organizations that helped us out with the Blitz, and the list is right there. A really top-notch group of organizations. So we had our list of sites. We assembled our army of shorebirders. So the next step was to set out across the coast to count shorebirds. So each site needed to be surveyed once during the survey window, which was between August 5th and the 14th, 2023. And they used the existing International Shorebird Survey protocol to count the birds and to enter the data. So International Shorebird Survey uses eBird for data entry. So this made it very convenient for a lot of our participants because they already use eBird. But it also ensured that the data contributed to the existing ISS database. We added a few additional guidelines just to improve the data quality of the Blitz. So the first one was that we asked the surveyors to conduct their surveys during high tide. And this is because shorebirds will use sites differently based on the tide stage. So typically, shorebirds will feed during low tide. This is because intertidal habitats like mud flats or low marsh areas will be exposed during this time. And the little marine invertebrates and critters that live in these intertidal areas that shorebirds like to eat will also be exposed during this time. So it's a great time for them to feed. And then as the tide starts to go up and cover these intertidal areas, the shorebirds tend to head to higher ground to sleep off their meals. And we call this roosting. So shorebirds are typically easier to count while they're roosting because they're all kind of collected in one area, not moving around, as opposed to when they're feeding and they're spread out over extensive mud flats or salt marshes. So that was one guideline that we set. And then the other one is that we asked surveyors of sites that were nearby each other to coordinate and conduct their surveys at the same time. And this is because some shorebirds use a network of sites to fulfill all their feeding and sleeping needs. So they might use one site during low tide for feeding, and then as the tide goes up, fly to another site to roost during high tide. So by doing surveys at nearby sites at the same time, we were minimizing double counting birds that use multiple sites. In the top, you can see some cute little sanderlings roosting, and then there's a feeding frenzy over here with some red knots. So yeah, the Blitz went really well. Everyone had a whole lot of fun, and the results are in. So 89 participants surveyed 115 sites throughout the state. So each circle represents a site, and you can see we got pretty good coverage along the mainland coast and also on Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. We counted 73,088 shorebirds of 29 different species. So the larger the circle, the more shorebirds were counted at a site. And then the darker the color of the circle, the more species were observed at the site. So I know there's a lot going on this map, but I did make an interactive web map. If anyone's interested in exploring the data more, I'm happy to send it to you. So feel free to reach out. So I'll start with some site highlights. Manomet National Wildlife Refuge had both the most shorebirds counted and the most species observed. So there was over 23,000 shorebirds there of 21 different species. So this wasn't a huge surprise. We already knew that Manomet was a shorebird hotspot. And as you can see from this photo, this is just a taste of what it looked like out there on the Blitz survey day. There were just shorebirds everywhere. And you can see in this map on the right, you can see that there's a nice network of mud flats at Manomet for birds to feed at. And it's right next to a bunch of barrier islands that make great roosting habitat. So it's kind of a one-stop shop for migrating shorebirds to get all their needs in one place. And as a bonus, it's a national wildlife refuge, so it's better protected than other sites along the coast, less disturbance from humans and dogs and large mammalian predators. So top-notch site. There's a couple of other standout sites that I'd like to highlight. The first one's Sandy Neck. It's down in Barnstable, well, I guess up in Barnstable, over in Barnstable on the Cape, but it's I had the second highest number of shorebirds with over 5,800 shorebirds counted. And it's a large barrier beach, and it's a great roosting site for all the shorebirds that feed in the marshes and mudflats around Barnstable Harbor. The other standout site is Parker River National Wildlife Refuge up on the North Shore. This had the second highest number of species observed with 17 species. It also had a really respectable number of shorebirds too, with over 5,000. This site also wasn't a surprise. It's embedded within the Great Marsh Wizard site that I mentioned earlier. It's also a National Wildlife Refuge, so it's well protected. And there was plenty more productive shorebird sites throughout the coast, and I wish I had time to cover them all. But we're going to turn to species highlights now. So our top two most abundant species were both small, brown, and semi-palmated. So semi-palmated refers to the partial webbing in between their toes. So we had the semi-palmated sandpiper that was our top species with over 25,000. and semi-palmated plover with over 24,000. And these species were not only very plentiful and in large groups, they were also found at more sites than any other species. This is a map of their distribution, and they were spread out throughout the entire coast. So you can pretty much find them anywhere. This wasn't the case with all shorebird species, though. There were a few that could actually only be found south of Boston, where it's a little sandier. And in some extreme cases, we had 4 species that were only found at one site each during the Blitz. So we had the red knot and the American golden plover that were both only found at Manomet. The upland sandpiper that was only found at Stouffer's Puddle in Sandwich, also on the Cape. And the Wilson's phalarope that was only found at Nauset Marsh on the outer Cape. So it was really interesting to see the differences in distribution and numbers of all these species. So here's a little species breakdown. We have a table with the top 10 species and their respective numbers. And then we have a little pie chart showing kind of a percentage of each of those species compared to the total number of shorebirds counted. So as I mentioned, 29 species total. And then our 2 semi-palmated friends made up almost 75% of all the shorebirds counted. So that's a lot. Some notable mentions are sanderling, short-billed dowagers, and black-bellied plovers. I will mention that if we had done this Blitz at a different time during the season, like maybe if we were to do it, had done it a little bit later in the season, like August, the species composition would probably be a little bit different. And that's because different species of shorebirds have a different migration schedule. So some migrate sooner, and so their numbers peak sooner in the season, and some migrate a little bit later. So that's kind of an interesting thing to think about when surveying. Another thing that could change the results throughout the migration season is that oftentimes the adult shorebirds will migrate before the juvenile. So they'll kind of, fledge their chicks and then just hurry up and leave to head south and leave the chicks to fend for themselves and navigate their first migration on their own. So that's another factor that could potentially change the results throughout the season. So we acknowledge just that this Blitz is kind of just a snapshot of migration in Massachusetts. It doesn't tell the full story, but it can tell us something. So as I mentioned, it'll contribute to the larger ISS data set, and that can be used to help create population estimates and to see trends over time. And as I mentioned, we're going to be repeating this survey annually. So hopefully we'll be able to see some trends in Massachusetts over time as well. It's also been able to identify some important shorebird sites in the state, and this can help when we're planning conservation efforts in the state. You can kind of focus on certain sites. We actually have a University of Rhode Island student who recently reached out to use our data. She wants to compare the very large, well-known shorebird sites like Great Marsh and Manomet with networks of smaller sites throughout the state to see what the relative importance is for shorebirds. So we're looking forward to seeing her results. Another takeaway is that these methods can be used to answer different questions about shorebirds. So this kind of like citizen science mixed with, shorebird biologists, kind of a survey. We could use it to tell us, answer some questions about different seasons, like spring migration, and for specific species. Like we have a few researchers that reached out who are doing studies on Rhode turnstone and purple sandpipers. They're interested in doing a similar Blitz type effort to get estimates on these species in the state. And finally, and most importantly, the survey fostered collaboration between both shorebird professionals and skilled shorebird enthusiasts and volunteers throughout the state. And it was just really fun survey, and I really look forward to the next one in 2024. And a big thank you to all the volunteers and partners. If any of you can hear me, thank you. Yeah, if you're interested in contributing to the next Massachusetts Shorebird Blitz, or if you'd like to, put on your own Shorebird Blitz in your state, maybe even Rhode Island, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to either get you involved some way or help you plan your own Blitz.